There is a photograph that will never be printed. A man in a soaked black coat, standing in the wreckage of somebody else's empire. And behind him, half swallowed by shadow, a woman in emerald green holding the match. 6 months before that night, she had been on her knees on the 41st floor of a Chicago tower, wiping other people's fingerprints off a boardroom table. And not one of them had ever learned her name. They said things about Damiano Vitale in this city, but they said them quietly and never twice. And when he finally turned and looked at Nora Bennett, really looked the way a man looks at a weapon he has spent his whole life waiting to find, he said the only sentence that ever mattered: "Marry me, and I will take apart every person who ever made you small." 9 days of rain, and the city had stopped pretending it would end. Nora Bennett rode the freight elevator up through Meridian Tower at 11 at night with a cart that rattled like a bad cough. 41 floors of glass hanging over the loop, and she cleaned 11 of them. 4 nights a week for a wage that had not moved in 3 years. Her back ached in a place that had its own name by now. Her shoes were wet through. The elevator smelled like lemon chemical and old coffee, and it was the only place in the building where she ever felt like she was allowed to exist. She was 31. She was a size 22. She had a mother in a care facility on the west side whose lungs were failing in slow, expensive increments, and an invoice in her coat pocket that she had read so many times the fold had worn through the paper. $18,400. Due in 31 days. Her father would have known what to do. Thomas Bennett had run a freight yard on the south branch of the river for 19 years, and he had known where every dollar in the city slept at night. He had also known at the end exactly who had put the contraband in his containers and exactly whose signature had been forged on the manifests, and he had said the name out loud to the wrong people. He died in a state facility 11 months into a sentence he should never have served. The yard was sold at auction. The house went with it. Nora had been 23, and she had learned the only lesson Chicago ever really teaches: the truth is worth nothing if you cannot afford to enforce it. The name she never said out loud was Cesare Bruno. She kept it under her tongue like a stone. The 41st floor had a party on it that night, which meant Nora had to work around the guests instead of behind them. Meridian Global was celebrating something: a merger, an acquisition, a number. There were waiters carrying champagne in narrow flutes, and women in dresses that cost more than her mother's monthly bill, and the whole room had that smell rich rooms get: cold flowers and warm money. Gerald Thorne found her by the west windows with her cart. He was her supervisor's supervisor, a man of about 50 with an expensive haircut and the particular cruelty of someone who had never once been told no. He looked at her the way you look at a stain on a rented tuxedo. "You're not supposed to be on this floor before midnight. Somebody broke a glass at the bar. Dispatch called it in. Then be quick and be small." He said it without heat, which was worse. Half these people are the reason you have a job. Try not to remind them what it costs. She said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence was cheaper than dignity and lasted longer. And that was when Camilla Ashford came over. Nora knew her by sight, the way everyone in the city did. Old Lake Forest money, a face like something carved for a museum lobby, the kind of thin that requires a full-time staff. She had a glass in one hand and an audience in the other, and she stopped a careful 4 feet away from Nora as though weight might be contagious. "Oh God, don't move her," Camilla said, loud enough for the circle around her. "She's the only thing in this room with any structural integrity. If she leans, the floor goes." Somebody laughed. Then more of them did, the way a room does when it is given permission. Camilla tilted her glass and let the champagne go. Not thrown, that would have been passion. Just released, the way you pour something out. It went down the front of Nora's uniform and pooled in the seam of the vinyl. "There," Camilla said pleasantly. "Now you've got something to clean up. That's what you're for, isn't it?" The room did not go quiet. That was the part Nora would remember. Nobody stopped. The music kept going, and the waiters kept moving, and the whole floor simply flowed around her the way water flows around a rock, and she stood there in her wet uniform, 31 years old, with her mother's invoice folded in her coat, and understood that she had never been a person in this building. She had been furniture. She turned to go, and the room went cold. Not silent. Cold. Like a door had been opened somewhere below, and the whole tower had felt it. Damiano Vitale had come out of the elevator. Nora had never seen him before, but she recognized him the way you recognize weather. He was not the biggest man in the room. He was not the loudest. He wore a black suit with no shine to it at all, and rain still sat in his hair, and he moved through that crowd of very rich people like a hand moving through smoke, and every single one of them found somewhere else to look. He stopped in front of Camilla Ashford. "Say it again," he said. His voice was quiet, almost polite. That was the thing that made the back of Nora's neck prickle. There was no anger in it anywhere. It was the tone a man uses when he has already decided something and is only confirming the paperwork. Camilla's smile stayed on her face and left her eyes. "Damiano, I didn't." The joke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You made it for the room. The room's still here. Say it again." The silence stretched until it hurt. Someone put a glass down, and the sound was enormous. "It was nothing," Camilla said. "It was a joke." "Then you'll remember it." He looked at her for exactly as long as it took for the color to leave her throat. "So will I." He turned, and then Damiano Vitale looked at Nora Bennett, soaked, humiliated, still holding a rag, and something in his face changed by about a millimeter, and Nora had the strangest sensation of being seen fully and instantly, like a light coming on in a room she had assumed was empty. He took off his coat. He put it around her shoulders himself, and it was heavy and warm, and it smelled like rain and cedar, and he did it in front of 90 people, slowly, so that every one of them had to watch. "Come with me," he said. "You're done here." "I don't." Her voice cracked, and she hated it. "I have 4 more floors." "No," Damiano said. "You don't." He walked her to the elevator. Behind them, Gerald Thorne started to say something about protocol, and Damiano stopped and looked at him, and Gerald Thorne discovered he had nothing to say after all. The doors closed. The tower dropped away beneath them. Nora stared at the floor numbers. Her heart was going like a bird against a window. "Why?" she said. "Because I've been looking for you for 4 months," said Damiano Vitale, "and I did not expect to find you on your knees." The car was black and warm, and it smelled like nothing at all, which somehow cost more than perfume. He told her the truth in 11 minutes, which she would later understand was the most extravagant gift he ever gave anyone. The Vitale family had spent 2 years trying to pull apart Cesare Bruno's shipping operation and had failed every time because Bruno had built it on a chassis that already existed, a legitimate freight yard on the South Branch, with 19 years of clean paperwork and a good name attached to it. A dead man's name. "Thomas Bennett," Damiano said. "Your father." Nora's hands had gone numb. "He kept a second set," Damiano said. "Everyone said he didn't. Everyone was wrong. He mailed something to an address in Berwyn 11 days before he died, and I have spent 4 months finding out who lived there." "My aunt," Nora whispered. "She passed in April. I have." She stopped. She heard her own voice from very far away. "There are boxes in my mother's storage unit. I never opened them. I couldn't." Damiano said nothing for a long moment. Rain crawled sideways across the glass. "Then you have the only thing in this city that frightens Cesare Bruno," he said, "and you have been cleaning toilets for $11 an hour." She laughed. It came out wrong, jagged, closer to a sob. "So that's what this is. You want the boxes. I could have taken the boxes." He said it without cruelty, which is how she knew it was true. "I've known where they were for 6 days. Then what do you want?" He turned and looked at her, and for the first time she saw what was under the stillness, something old and burned out and very tired. A man who had been alone at the top of something for so long he had forgotten there was another way to stand. A wife, Damiano Vitale said. Bruno can't touch a Vitale. He can touch a cleaner from Bridgeport whenever he likes. If your name is mine, you walk into any room in this city and nobody breathes wrong near you. And when we open those boxes, you won't be a witness he can bury. You'll be a Vitale making a claim. He paused. Marry me. And I will take apart every person who ever made you small, starting with the woman who poured champagne on you and ending with the man who killed your father. The car stopped at a light. The whole city hung there dripping. That's not a proposal, Nora said. That's a contract. Yes. Say the rest of it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile? The place a smile would go, if he still had one. The rest of it, he said, is that I watched you stand in that room with champagne running down you, and your spine did not bend. I have men who've killed for me who bend. You didn't. He looked away out at the rain. So no. It's not only a contract. Nora Bennett looked down at her hands. Cracked knuckles, short nails, bleach-pale skin, and thought about her mother's lungs and a freight yard on the South Branch, and a name she had kept under her tongue for 8 years, like a stone she couldn't swallow or spit out. Yes, she said. They gave her a stylist for the first event. His name was Fabien Cross, and he arrived with 2 assistants and a rack of clothing in every shade of apology. Now, he said, circling her, the instinct here is camouflage. Vertical line, dark column, something forgiving through the waist. We want to minimize. No, Damiano said from the doorway. Fabien turned, delighted, already agreeing. Of course, a softer minimize. You want her to be sorry, Damiano said, in a room full of people who should be sorry. The stylist opened his mouth. You're finished here, Damiano said. Enzo, pay him for the day. He went to the rack himself. Nora watched him move hangers with 2 fingers like he was checking bodies for weapons, and he pulled out one thing and held it up. Emerald green, heavy silk, cut so that nothing about her was in question. This, he said. That's not hiding anything. That's the idea. He handed it to her, and his fingers touched hers, and neither of them moved for a second longer than made sense. You've spent your whole life being told your body's an apology. Wear it like a threat, instead. See what the room does. She wore it to the Ashford Foundation Gala 11 days later. She had spent 3 hours being terrified in the car. And then the doors opened, and Nora Bennett walked into that ballroom on Damiano Vitale's arm in emerald green, with her chin up and her shoulders back. And she watched 200 people who had looked straight through her for a decade turn one by one and find her. And she understood something that rearranged her whole life. They had never been laughing because she was too much. They had been laughing because she was unguarded. And she wasn't anymore. Camilla Ashford was by the bar. Nora walked past her close enough for the silk to whisper and did not look at her. And that, Grace Molina told her later, cackling into the phone, that was the part that went through the room like a blade. She didn't look. The slow burn was the dangerous part, and Nora knew it and did nothing about it. He came to the house on Astor Street at strange hours. She'd find him at 2 in the morning at the kitchen island with his sleeves pushed up and blood dried in the crease of his knuckles, drinking coffee, staring at the wall. And he would not lie to her about where he'd been. That was their arrangement. Nobody had ever refused to lie to her before. She hadn't known how intimate the truth could be. She learned that he had been 14 when his father died and 19 when the family became his, and that he had not slept a full night since. She learned that Enzo Marchetti, the enforcer with the flat eyes, brought him soup when he thought no one noticed. She learned that Damiano Vitale was not a good man and had stopped auditioning for the role a long time ago, and that he was in the specific and terrifying way of dangerous men, gentle with her. Putting a glass of water by her elbow, holding a door, saying her name like it'd wait. You could have anyone, she said one night. She hated herself for saying it. He looked at her for a long moment across the dark kitchen. That's the thing about a room where everyone's for sale, he said. You stop being able to hear anything real. Then you walked into it with champagne in your hair and you weren't selling. She didn't touch him. He didn't touch her. It was, she thought, the loudest thing that had ever happened to her. The boxes came out of storage on a Thursday. 19 years of manifests, and in the fourth box, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, a green ledger in her father's terrible handwriting, dates, container numbers, and a signature line filled in over and over in an ink that was not Thomas Bennett's. Nora sat on the floor of that storage unit and cried for 11 minutes, and then she stood up and wiped her face and said, "Gerald Thorne signed off on the customs brokerage. His name is in here 40 times. Damiano said, "Then he's first." "No," Nora said, "he's mine." They took Gerald Thorne apart in 9 days, and Nora did it with a phone and a copier and 8 years of knowing exactly how a building works when nobody thinks you're a person. She knew which floor the auditors used. She knew that Meridian's document room was cleaned at 1040 a.m., and that the badge reader on the south stairwell had been broken since March, and that a woman in a cleaning uniform can walk anywhere in a corporate tower at any hour and be less visible than a chair. Grace Molina still worked nights. Grace let her in. The ledger pages went to the Tribune, to the SEC, and the part Damiano admitted afterward he had not thought of, to Gerald Thorne's wife. He was walked out of Meridian Tower on a Tuesday morning through the lobby, in front of the whole floor, with a box in his arms. Nora watched from the coffee place across the street with her hands wrapped around a paper cup, and she felt exactly nothing, and then she felt something enormous and quiet and clean. And she understood she was not going to stop until it was all the way finished. "He'll never work again," Enzo said, appearing at her elbow like weather. "He'll be fine," Nora said. "He'll write a book. That's what men like him do." She sipped her coffee. "Bruno's next." Enzo Marchetti looked at her for a long second. Then, very slightly, the enforcer inclined his head, the way you do to somebody's boss. The retaliation came for her mother. That was the part Nora had not prepared for, and she would carry it for the rest of her life. The call came at 4:15 in the morning. A man had come to the West Side facility asking for Margaret Bennett's room number, and the night nurse had told him and then thought about it for 20 minutes and then thought better of it and called the emergency contact. Nora did not wake Damiano. She would think about that later, too. She drove herself, and she was in the corridor on the 3rd floor at 4:40 in the morning when she saw a man in scrubs at the far end who did not belong in them. The scrubs were wrong, pressed. Nobody's scrubs at 4:40 a.m. are pressed, and he was carrying a syringe wrong, thumb over the plunger, holding it like a knife instead of a tool. They called him Kane. She didn't know that yet. Nora Bennett had cleaned that building's sister facility for 2 years when she was 25. She knew what was in the corridor. She hit the fire alarm. The world went white and screaming. Strobes, sirens, and every door on the floor opening at once. Staff pouring out. 40 witnesses in 11 seconds. Kane turned. He looked at her down the length of that corridor, and she saw him do the arithmetic. 1 cleaner, no cameras, easy. And then she pulled the emergency oxygen shut-off, and the corridor went into hard lockdown, and the fire doors came down between them with a sound like a coffin closing. She stood in the strobing red light with her back against the wall, and her heart trying to climb out of her mouth, and she was still standing there when Damiano arrived 20 minutes later. She had never seen him run before. She never saw it again. He came through the fire door with Enzo behind him, and his face was... She had no word for it. It was not rage. Rage is loud. This was the thing rage is made out of, before it cools into something usable. They found Kane in the parking structure. Nora did not watch. She heard it. A single sound, short and final, and then the rain again. Damiano came back with his knuckles split and his coat torn at the shoulder and blood on his shirt that was not his, and he stopped in front of her in the ambulance bay under the sodium lights, and he was shaking. Not from fear, from the effort of holding it in his hands instead of letting it out into the world. He knew the room number, Damiano said. His voice was wrecked. Nora, he knew the room number. 4 people alive know where your mother sleeps. She took his face in both hands. His skin was cold from the rain. There was blood on her palms and she didn't care. Then, one of them is a liar, she said, and we're going to find out which. And he kissed her. It was not sweet. It was not gentle. It was a man who'd spent his entire life keeping a door shut, finally putting his shoulder through it, one hand hard at the back of her neck, the other fisted in emerald silk, holding her like the ground was going, and she was the only fixed point in Chicago. She kissed him back with everything 8 years of silence had built in her. The rain came down on both of them in the ambulance bay, and neither of them moved for a long time. "You should be afraid of me," he said against her mouth. "I've been afraid of everyone my whole life," Nora said. "You're the only one I picked." 4 people knew where Margaret Bennett slept: Damiano, Enzo Marchetti, Salvatore Conti, the old consigliere who had buried 3 generations of Vitals and had not raised his voice since 1994, and Renzo Fontana, underboss, best man at the wedding they hadn't had yet. The one who'd found Nora's storage unit, the one who had put his hand on Damiano's shoulder at the hospital and said, "We'll find him, brother." It was Nora who caught it, because Nora had spent a decade in rooms where nobody thought she could hear. Renzo had told her 3 weeks earlier that he'd never met her father. Casually, warmly, over dinner. And in the 4th box, in the green ledger, in Thomas Bennett's handwriting dated 11 years ago, R. Fontana, Yard Gate, 1140p. Amy signed for load 6. He hadn't just met him. He had been the one who let the containers in. "He's been Bruno's since before he was yours," Nora said quietly, laying the page on the table in front of Damiano. "He didn't turn. He was never yours to begin with." Salvatore Conti read it twice through his reading glasses. Then the old man took them off and looked at Nora for a long moment with an expression she couldn't read. 29 years I've watched this family," he said. "Nobody found that. Nobody looked." He folded his glasses. "She's not a wife, Damiano. She's the sharpest thing in this house. They did not kill Renzo Fontana. That was Nora's decision, and it was crueler. They let him keep talking. For 9 days every plan that went to Renzo went to Cesare Bruno, and every one of them was a lie, and Bruno moved his money and his men and his lawyers exactly where Nora wanted them, like a man rearranging his own furniture for a fire. On the 10th day, they let him walk into the room and see her sitting at the head of the table. She never forgot his face. Cesare Bruno was 71 years old, and he looked like somebody's grandfather, and that was the last lie he ever told. They took him in his own dining room on the far south side on a Tuesday, in the rain. Enzo took the door. Damiano took the room, and Nora Bennett walked in last, in emerald green, and she was the one who sat down across from him. "You don't know who I am," she said. Bruno looked at her, thin gray eyes, mild as milk. "Should I?" "No," Nora said. "That's what I came to tell you. You ruined my father, and you never learned his name. And you sent a man to my mother's room, and you never learned mine. And that's the whole reason you're going to lose everything." She laid the green ledger on the table between them. 19 years of it. Because you thought people like us don't keep records. She watched him look at his own forged signature. She watched him understand. She had thought for 8 years that this moment would be loud. It wasn't. It was the quietest thing that ever happened to her. He aged about a decade in the space of one breath, and something went out of him and did not come back, and Nora Bennett sat there in her dead father's silence and let it. "What do you want?" Cesare Bruno said. His voice had cracks in it now. "Nothing," Nora said. "That's the part you can't survive. There's nothing you have that I want. The federal case took 14 months. The ledger did most of it. Renzo Fontana offered the only door left open to him, did the rest, and lived, which he came to consider the punishment it was. Eleanor Prescott, who had sat on the review board that fast-tracked Thomas Bennett's file and had taken a Bruno consultancy 9 days later, resigned in front of a bank of cameras and did not answer a single question. The Bruno freight operation was seized and sold. Camilla Ashford's foundation lost every donor it had within a season for reasons nobody would explain to her, which was itself the message. And a freight yard on the south branch of the river, 19 years clean and 8 years stolen, went back on the deed under the name Bennett. Margaret Bennett lived to see it. She was in a chair by the window with an oxygen line in her nose, and she looked at the sign for a long time, and then she said, "Your father used to say the river never gives anything back." "It doesn't," Nora said. "You have to go in after it." They married in October, in a church on the near north side with rain hammering the windows, and Salvatore Conti gave her away because there was no one else and because he had asked. The whole city came. Every person who had ever stepped over her sat in those pews in a good coat and watched Nora Bennett walk up the aisle. And nobody laughed and nobody looked away. And every one of them understood the arithmetic of the room they were sitting in. This is what she does to people who hurt her, and she is not finished being alive. At the reception, Damiano put his mouth against her ear and said, "Any regrets?" Nora looked out at all of them, the money, the manners, the fear, and thought about a woman on her knees on the 41st floor with champagne running down her uniform, and how that woman would not have believed a word of this. "One," she said. "It took me 31 years to find out I was never the joke. I was just the only one in the room who wasn't in on it." They looked at her for a decade and saw something to step over. Not one of them ever bothered to learn her name, and it cost them everything they had. Because the person you decide is invisible is the person who sees every single thing you do. Nora Bennett didn't get saved. She got counted, finally, and then she did the math. If you're the one they underestimate, stay exactly where you are. They'll never see you coming. Hit like if you watched Camilla Ashford's face when that room went cold. Share this with someone who's been made small by people who couldn't carry her shoes. And subscribe, because next week a man in a black coat learns that the woman he underestimated has been keeping her own ledger. And comment below with the moment you'd have paid money to see. I'll read everyone.